Angela Thomas had always been a determined woman. As a state prosecutor, she had worked her way up from the bottom, facing countless obstacles along the way. But today, she was feeling good. It had been a long, successful day at the courthouse, and she was finally on her way home. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city. Angela looked forward to a quiet evening of relaxation, maybe with a good book or her favorite TV show. Little did she know that the calm evening she expected was about to be shattered by an unexpected turn of events. As Angela drove through the busy streets of the city, she noticed the flashing lights of a police car in her rearview mirror. She immediately slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, wondering if she had somehow made a mistake. Maybe she had been speeding, or perhaps there was some issue with her registration. Whatever the reason, she had always been respectful to law enforcement and trusted that everything would be resolved quickly. When the police officer approached her car, Angela rolled down her window, offering a friendly smile. The officer, a white man in his 30s, looked down at her with a stern expression, almost as if he had already made some judgment about her. Without any greeting, he demanded license and registration. Angela handed over her documents, staying calm. "Good evening, officer," she said politely. "Is there an issue?" The officer barely glanced at her, his eyes scanning the papers in his hand. After a long pause, he looked back up at her, his expression still cold. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he ordered. Angela was taken aback. "Excuse me, is there a problem, officer? I'm happy to comply, but is this really necessary?" Without answering, the officer reached for his radio and spoke into it. Angela felt her heart start to race. This was all so sudden. She was just a regular person, trying to get home after a long day at work. But the officer's behavior felt more like an interrogation than a simple traffic stop. Reluctantly, Angela opened the car door and stepped out. She kept her hands visible and tried to remain calm, but the officer's commanding presence made her feel small and uncomfortable. "What is this about? I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of confusion. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at her up and down, and then to her car, almost as if he was searching for something to pin on her. Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "I need to see your ID," he said, his voice now more demanding than before. "I've given you my license and registration already," Angela replied, trying to keep the situation from escalating. "I'm a state prosecutor. If there's a misunderstanding, I can explain." The officer scoffed, looking at her with disbelief. "A prosecutor, huh? Sure." He seemed to doubt her words, and Angela could tell by the way his eyes lingered on her that he wasn't convinced. It didn't matter to him that she was a respected member of the legal community. To him, she was just another person to be controlled. Angela took a deep breath. She had faced many challenges in her career, but this was different. This was personal. This officer wasn't just questioning her actions. He was questioning her worth, based on nothing more than assumptions. "I'm telling you the truth," Angela insisted, her voice firm. "Please, check my ID. I am who I say I am." But the officer, determined to hold control of the situation, refused to back down. Without a word, he suddenly grabbed her arm and began to place her in handcuffs. Angela's heart pounded in her chest. How had things escalated so quickly? She couldn't believe what was happening. "I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction," the officer said, his words cold and final. Angela felt a surge of anger rise in her. She had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. This was the moment she realized that the officer wasn't just questioning her authority. He was questioning her very identity. And now she would have to fight back, not just for her own dignity, but for the truth. Angela's mind raced as she stood there, her hands now cuffed behind her back. She couldn't believe this was happening. How had her simple drive home turned into a nightmare? She had always prided herself on staying calm under pressure, but this situation was different. She was being treated like a criminal. and she hadn't done anything wrong. The officer, Officer Blake, seemed oblivious to her frustration. He kept his grip firmly on her arm, leading her toward his patrol car without saying another word. Angela tried to keep her composure, but her heart pounded in her chest. This was a nightmare she hadn't prepared for, not as a successful state prosecutor, not as someone who had worked tirelessly to earn her place in the legal system. Angela thought back to her years of hard work, her struggle to make it as a woman of color in a field dominated by others who didn't look like her. She had earned her spot at the top, built her career with integrity and dedication, and now she was being treated as if none of that mattered. The officer shoved her into the back of the patrol car, his actions rough but not violent. Angela couldn't help but wonder, why was he so determined to undermine her? She had told him she was a state prosecutor, but he hadn't even bothered to verify her identity. Instead, he'd made assumptions, treated her with suspicion, and now was taking her into custody. Angela tried to stay calm, but frustration bubbled up inside her. She knew that this was about more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was about the prejudice and bias that people like her faced every day, no matter how successful they were. As she sat in the back of the patrol car, Angela's mind raced. What was going to happen next? Was she going to spend the night in jail? Would her career be ruined by this mistake? She had worked so hard to build a reputation as a tough, respected prosecutor. And yet, here she was, sitting in the back of a police car, arrested for something she didn't do. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she was unable to reach it due to the handcuffs. It was only when the car finally stopped, and the officer opened the door to take her inside the station, that she was able to access her phone. She quickly dialed her assistant's number. "Angela, are you okay?" came the voice on the other end. It was a calm, familiar voice, but Angela could hear the concern in it. "I'm fine," Angela said, trying to hold back the rising emotion in her voice. "But I need you to do something for me. I've been arrested by Officer Blake. I need you to get in touch with my colleagues. Get them to help me." Her assistant was stunned. "What? Why? What happened?" Angela briefly explained, her voice shaking with the effort of staying composed. "He pulled me over, and when I tried to explain who I was, he didn't believe me. He's taking me in for obstruction." Her assistant promised to get to work on her release immediately, but Angela knew the damage had already been done. The truth didn't seem to matter to Officer Blake. In his eyes, she was just another black woman, a threat he needed to control. The injustice of it all burned inside her. As they entered the police station, the officer led her to a small holding room, where she was left alone to wait. She sat down on the cold metal bench, feeling a deep sense of helplessness. Angela had always fought for justice, for others who had been wronged. But now she was the one in need of a voice. She was the one who needed to be heard. She knew that things would not end here. She couldn't let this moment define her. This was only the beginning, and she would make sure Officer Blake and everyone else understood that no one, no matter their race or position, should be treated with such disregard. She had worked too hard, come too far, and proven herself too many times to let this injustice stand. Angela was determined to fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated by those who were supposed to protect and serve. This was her fight, and she was not going to back down. Angela sat in the small, cold holding room, the silence pressing down on her. The dim fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting an uncomfortable glow. She tried to calm her racing thoughts, but it was difficult. Her mind kept going back to the events that had led her here, being pulled over on a routine drive, trying to explain who she was, and yet being treated like a criminal. She had faced plenty of adversity in her career, but nothing had ever felt so personal. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. It was about the deeper, uglier prejudices that still existed, even in a world where she had worked so hard to break barriers. As the minutes dragged on, Angela tried to stay composed. She was a seasoned prosecutor. She had been in and out of courtrooms for years. But this was different. This was not just about law and order. This was about her very identity being dismissed, her authority ignored because of her race and gender. She could feel her anger building, but she also knew that she couldn't let her emotions get the best of her. This was a moment where her composure would make all the difference. Her phone, which she had placed on silent earlier, vibrated against her pocket. Angela quickly pulled it out and checked the screen. Her assistant's name flashed across the screen, and she immediately answered. Angela, her assistant's voice was full of concern. We're working on getting you released. I've already contacted your colleagues at the courthouse, and they're making calls to the police department. I'm sure we can get you out of there soon. Angela exhaled deeply, grateful that her team was already on it. Thank you. I just need to get out of here. But you have to understand, this is bigger than just me. This officer didn't just arrest me. He didn't believe me. And I'm sure I'm not the only one he's treated this way. Her assistant hesitated before responding. I understand, Angela. This is going to make a lot of noise. We'll make sure this isn't swept under the rug. Angela nodded, though her frustration was still palpable. It's not just about me. It's about the countless others who face this every day. Those who don't have the resources to fight back. This needs to change. After a brief pause, her assistant replied, We'll make sure you're heard, Angela. This isn't over. Angela hung up the phone, trying to hold on to the small shred of hope her assistant had given her. She wasn't alone in this, but the feeling of helplessness in the moment was still heavy. She knew this wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity. It was a reminder of the systemic issues that continued to exist in law enforcement, and she couldn't help but wonder how many times this had happened to others. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she had faced far greater challenges in her career. She wasn't going to let this moment break her, but she was determined to make sure the world knew what had happened, to make sure that Officer Blake would be held accountable for his actions. The sound of footsteps outside the room broke her thoughts, and a door creaked open. Officer Blake stood in the doorway, looking at her with a mixture of confusion and defensiveness. Your lawyer's here, he said, clearly uncomfortable. They'll be taking you out soon. Angela stood up, brushing herself off. Her eyes locking with his, she felt a strange calm wash over her. Despite everything, she knew she had the power to control how this story would unfold. She would fight not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced in similar situations. As she walked out of the holding room, her lawyer entered, and the process of getting her released began. Angela knew it was only a matter of time before this injustice was rectified. But this incident would be more than just a fight to clear her name. It would become a movement, a symbol of the fight for justice and equality, and Angela would be the one leading it. Angela walked out of the police station, her head held high despite the frustration and confusion that still lingered from the ordeal. She was now free, but she knew that this was far from over. She had spent hours being questioned, detained, and treated with suspicion simply because of assumptions about her identity. It was a feeling she had never quite experienced in such a direct way before, and it weighed heavily on her. But she also knew that this was bigger than just her. She couldn't let this go unnoticed, not for her own sake, but for everyone who had faced this kind of treatment and didn't have the resources to stand up for themselves. As Angela stepped into the car, her mind was racing. The more she thought about the events, the more she realized how deeply ingrained the prejudices she had faced were. It wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the system that allowed this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. It was about how people, particularly those from marginalized communities, were often judged not for their actions, but for how they looked or what others assumed about them. She pulled out her phone and called her assistant, who had been instrumental in getting her release from the holding cell. I'm free, Angela said, her voice steady, but tinged with exhaustion. But this is far from over. Her assistant, Emily, responded quickly. I know. I've already made arrangements for a press statement. We need to make sure this doesn't get buried. People need to know what happened. Angela leaned back in the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. It's not just about me, Emily. It's about the countless others who are treated like this every day. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern. I understand, Emily replied. We'll handle the press, but I need you to focus on what comes next. The first step is to file a formal complaint against Officer Blake. We'll need to gather evidence, and I'm already working with your colleagues to make sure we have all the facts straight. Angela took a deep breath. It was hard to focus on anything else, but she knew Emily was right. This was just the beginning of what would likely be a long and challenging process. But Angela had always believed in justice, and now it was time to make sure she used her position to fight for what was right. As she made her way back to her office, Angela reflected on the power dynamics that had played out during her arrest. She thought about the assumptions that Officer Blake had made about her and how quickly he had dismissed her words. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a failure to see her as a person, to believe in her authority and her identity. Angela wasn't just a successful state prosecutor. She was a woman who had fought to be heard in a world that often didn't listen. She couldn't let this moment slip away. Back at her office, Angela gathered her team and immediately began working on the next steps. She knew that exposing this injustice wasn't going to be easy, and the pressure was mounting. She would have to relive the events, share her story, and publicly confront the officer's actions. But she was ready. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about holding people accountable for their actions and making sure that this kind of discrimination didn't happen again. The public was already reacting. Her arrest had made headlines, and people were beginning to rally behind her. Angela was determined to use the momentum to bring real change. She wasn't just going to stop at making a point. She wanted to make sure that the system itself was forced to confront its flaws. The phone calls and emails were pouring in from news outlets, colleagues, and activists. As much as Angela wanted to focus on the legal aspects of her case, she knew that the eyes of the public were on her now. She had become a symbol of the fight for justice, and that was both empowering and overwhelming. Despite the challenges ahead, Angela felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. This was her moment to take a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wrongfully treated. With determination in her heart and the support of her team, she was ready to turn this painful experience into a catalyst for change. This battle was just beginning, and Angela was ready to fight it with everything she had. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity for Angela. She had become a public figure overnight, and now, more than ever, the weight of her situation began to sink in. While the news coverage focused heavily on her wrongful arrest, Angela knew she had to turn this moment into something positive, not just for herself, but for others who had faced similar injustice. She had a responsibility to use her platform and her influence to create lasting change. Her legal team worked tirelessly to gather evidence and file the necessary paperwork for the formal complaint against Officer Blake. But Angela knew that the legal battle wasn't the only fight she was facing. The public's attention was growing, and with it, the pressure to ensure that the message of her case was clear. This was not just about one officer's actions. It was about a system that needed to be held accountable for its prejudices. Angela decided to speak out. She knew the time had come to share her story, to make sure that her experience wasn't swept under the rug. With her legal team's support, she scheduled an interview with a major news network. The day of the interview arrived, and Angela was both nervous and resolute. She had been in front of cameras before, but this time was different. This wasn't about a case in the courtroom. It was about real change. Sitting across from the interviewer, Angela looked directly into the camera, her posture confident and her voice steady. What happened to me could happen to anyone. I am a state prosecutor, someone who has dedicated my life to upholding the law. And yet, I was treated as if I didn't matter. I was ignored, dismissed, and arrested because of assumptions based on the color of my skin. This is something I've experienced in different forms throughout my career, but it's not just about me. It's about all the people who don't have the platform to fight back. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The interviewer nodded, clearly moved by her story. "Do you think this situation could have been avoided?" they asked. Angela nodded. "Absolutely. If Officer Blake had taken the time to listen to me, if he had simply looked at my ID and believed what I said, none of this would have happened. But this isn't just about one incident. It's about the bigger issue of racial profiling and the bias that still exists in law enforcement. Too often, people are judged based on stereotypes, not on the facts in front of them. That has to change." As Angela spoke, she felt the power of her words. This was more than just a story. It was a call to action. She knew that her case would be the start of a much larger conversation about police accountability, fairness, and justice. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated or silenced. The interview was broadcast across the country, and the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to Angela, offering support and sharing their own stories of being wrongfully judged or mistreated. Angela began to realize just how many people had experienced similar situations, and it fueled her desire to make a real difference. Within a few days, a protest was organized outside the police department, demanding justice for Angela and accountability for Officer Blake. It was peaceful, with people holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and "Stand up for equality." Angela was deeply moved by the outpouring of support, and she knew that this moment could be the catalyst for real change. As the legal proceedings continued, Angela's case began to set a precedent. The police department had no choice but to investigate Officer Blake's actions. Angela's legal team worked alongside civil rights organizations to ensure that this wasn't just a case of individual misconduct. It was part of a larger pattern that needed to be addressed. For the first time in a long time, Angela felt hopeful. She had always believed in justice, and now it seemed like the system was finally starting to listen. The battle ahead would not be easy, but Angela knew that she was not alone. She had become a symbol of the fight for fairness and equality, and she was determined to continue that fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated as less than because of their race or background. The story was far from over, but Angela knew that with each passing day, she was making the difference, and that was something worth fighting for. As the days went on, the pressure mounted. Angela had become the face of a larger conversation about police accountability and racial profiling. Her story had gone viral, with people from all walks of life reaching out to express their support and share their own similar experiences. What had started as a painful personal incident had now turned into a powerful movement, one that was capturing the attention of not just the city but the entire nation. Angela, however, felt the weight of her new position. She wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. She had become a symbol for all those who had been wronged and unfairly treated. The support was overwhelming, but so was the scrutiny. There were interviews to give, meetings to attend, and legal processes to navigate. But in the midst of all of this, Angela remained focused on her mission: to bring real change to a system that had long allowed racial bias and discrimination to persist unchecked. The investigation into Officer Blake's actions was moving forward, and Angela was doing everything she could to ensure that the incident didn't just slip into the background. She worked closely with her legal team, her colleagues, and civil rights advocates to make sure the police department took her complaint seriously. Every conversation, every legal document, and every press statement she made was aimed at holding those in power accountable, but also at educating people about the deep-rooted issues that needed to be addressed. Meanwhile, the public's response only grew louder. Protests continued to take place outside the police department, and many citizens joined in, not just for Angela, but for the countless other individuals who had faced similar mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. The momentum was undeniable. It was clear that the incident had tapped into something larger, something that many people were ready to confront head-on. One afternoon, as Angela sat in her office, her phone rang. It was a number she recognized, a colleague from the courthouse. Angela had been so wrapped up in her personal situation that she hadn't had much time to focus on her usual cases. But she was still a prosecutor, and the work didn't stop just because of her current fight. She answered the phone, ready to switch gears and return to her duties. "Angela, we've been following your case closely," her colleague began. "There's something we need to talk about. We think there's an opportunity here for you to push even further, not just in your own case, but for larger reforms in the system." Angela listened intently. Her colleague explained that several lawmakers were now watching her case closely, and that there was a real opportunity to push for legislative change to address racial profiling and police misconduct. The idea of fighting on an even bigger scale, advocating for systemic change, filled Angela with both excitement and a deep sense of responsibility. She knew that change couldn't just come from one case. It needed to come from a shift in the laws, the policies, and the way people thought about race and policing. Over the next few weeks, Angela worked tirelessly with activists, lawmakers, and legal experts to draft a proposal for new policies aimed at combating racial bias in law enforcement. They called it the Justice for All Act, and it was designed to ensure that police officers across the country would be required to undergo regular training on racial sensitivity and bias, with consequences for officers found to be engaged in discriminatory practices. The bill also called for independent oversight of police departments, ensuring that there would be accountability and transparency in how officers were disciplined. The proposal quickly gained traction, with several prominent politicians and civil rights organizations pledging their support. Angela, ever the strategist, knew that passing this legislation would be a long road, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings regarding Officer Blake were moving along. The investigation into his actions was thorough, and the department had started looking into his history to determine if there were other cases of misconduct. As more information came to light, the public's pressure on the department grew stronger. The conversation was shifting. People were starting to see that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of systemic issues within law enforcement. As Angela prepared for the upcoming trial, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She had started out as just a woman doing her job, but now she was leading a movement for change. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable, but it was necessary. She had been pushed to the limits of what she thought she could handle, but in doing so, she had found a strength she hadn't realized was there. The day of the hearing had arrived, and Angela felt a mix of nervousness and determination. She had been through so much already, but this moment felt different. The weight of the case was heavier now, not just for her, but for all the people who had been watching and supporting her. She was no longer just a prosecutor facing an injustice. She was a voice for those who had been wronged by the system time and time again. As she arrived at the courthouse, she couldn't help but notice the crowd outside. People had gathered to show their support, holding signs that read "Justice for Angela" and "End Racial Profiling." The sight of so many people coming together for the cause reminded Angela of the impact this case had made. It was no longer just about her. It was about creating change and making sure that the voices of the marginalized were heard. Walking into the courthouse, Angela could feel the eyes of the public and the media on her. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but now that she was here, she felt the pressure building. The trial would be public, and everything she said and did would be under a microscope. But despite the nerves, she was focused. She had one goal in mind: to ensure Officer Blake was held accountable for his actions and to raise awareness about the larger issue of racial profiling in law enforcement. As she sat in the courtroom, waiting for the proceedings to begin, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. Just a few weeks ago, she had been arrested on the side of the road, treated as a criminal without any reason. Now she was about to stand in front of a judge and demand justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice at the hands of those meant to protect them. The courtroom was packed, with reporters sitting along the walls and spectators filling every available seat. Angela's legal team sat beside her, ready to present their case. Across from them, The defense team was preparing, trying to find any way to discredit Angela's account of the events. But Angela was resolute. She had the truth on her side, and she knew that in the end, that would be enough. When it was finally her turn to speak, Angela stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom. The room fell silent as she began her testimony, her voice steady and clear. She explained the events of the day she was arrested, the confusion, the humiliation, and the feeling of being dismissed simply because of her race. She described how she had tried to explain her identity as a state prosecutor, but was ignored. She spoke of the systemic bias that had led to this moment and how it had affected not just her, but countless others who had been treated unfairly by law enforcement. As she spoke, Angela felt a sense of empowerment that she hadn't felt before. This was her chance to make a difference, to ensure that her experience wasn't just a personal story. It was a turning point. Her words were met with silence from the audience, but she could tell that people were listening. She wasn't just a victim. She was a voice for change. The defense team tried to paint Angela as someone who had been difficult and uncooperative, but Angela stood firm. She had nothing to hide. She had done nothing wrong. It was Officer Blake's actions that were in question, not hers. The trial continued, with more evidence being presented and testimonies being heard. As the days passed, it became clear that Officer Blake had acted without cause. He had failed to verify Angela's identity when she had given him the chance, and he had escalated the situation based on his own prejudices. Angela's team argued that his actions were a clear violation of her rights and that the larger issue of racial profiling in policing needed to be addressed. The pressure was immense, but Angela remained focused. She knew that this wasn't just about this case. It was about setting a precedent for the future. She wasn't fighting just for herself, but for every person who had ever been unfairly treated by the system. After several days of testimony, the judge finally called for a recess. The tension in the courtroom was thick as everyone waited for the decision. Angela sat back in her seat, taking a deep breath. She knew that no matter the outcome of the trial, the conversation had already begun. People were talking, people were listening, and change was on the horizon. As the trial concluded, the judge announced that the case would go to deliberation. Angela had made her point. Now, all that was left was to wait and see how the justice system would respond. But one thing was certain. Angela had already won. She had taken a stand, and in doing so, she had created a ripple effect that would inspire others to do the same. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Angela felt hopeful. Change was coming, and she would be there to see it through.